So my presentation today is centered around the fact that we are all in the crisis. It's very hard, but we are experiencing it differently depending on our standing in society. But be that as it may, there's a big opportunity, maybe a once in a lifetime opportunity to change things, to reimagine our cities, and also to reimagine the kind of spaces that we build. I think what we're learning is that, as the previous speaker said, we need to build spaces that are place specific, that take into account the histories, the particularities, and so forth. But also we need inclusive spaces, but not just inclusive, but they need to be equitable and community-oriented public spaces, meaning as we build these public spaces, how do we begin to build communities? In terms of the lessons that we are learning, I'll just walk you through like some of the key lessons for the continent, but more specifically for South Africa. I think the crisis has really turned the spotlight on deep societal inequalities and systematic challenges. And these are things that we knew already because they emanate from history. In the case of South Africa, they emanate from colonialism, apartheid, and we can see the connection between history and, in the case of apartheid, spatial apartheid planning, and also in terms of health. And at the same time, it has worsened other challenges that we have, the standing items, things that we've been advocating for, the plight of people who are experiencing homelessness and informal workers, and issues like domestic violence. But at the same time, the lockdown restrictions as a result of the pandemic, it sort of introduced us again to our neighborhoods. We begin to see how we live, whether good or bad. But at the same time, we have these policies that talk about integrated and sustainable human settlements. But we see now they are not really integrated. So I think the question is, what becomes the role of public spaces in addressing those challenges? And maybe it won't take public spaces to address everything, but certainly it can contribute to the social change that is needed. And as we are doing that, I think it's important not to slide back with respect to other standing items like issues around climate change, and for Africa, the fact that we've got youthful population. So this is just a graph to demonstrate what we're talking about. If you can Google today, just Google green apartheid. There's a recent journal that has been produced. It has shown how the pandemic has revealed green apartheid in South Africa, where you see suburbs adjacent to informal settlements, suburbs that are leafy, lushy, adjacent to informal settlements that are dusty and with nothing. So how do you begin to deal with those things? And one of the statistics, the data that is showing us is that in these leafy suburbs in South Africa, you've got rich people, white people who've got public space like in 700 kilometers away. At the same time, you've got people living in informal settlements, mostly black, in townships and informal settlements, with the access of green spaces 2.6 kilometers away. So those discrepancies, you know, so going forward, what is the role for public space in terms of dealing with that? And then in terms of informal settlements, we saw sharper focus in terms of informal settlements. Again, it's about the relationship between private and public in terms of how we build settlements. And then I think as cities, we must really strengthen tactical urbanism, the role of small-scale improvements that go a long way in terms of developing a sense of community, really working with inhabitants of informal settlements. And I must say, coming from Johannesburg, I think we need to change our attitude. We like big infrastructural projects, and we are so scared of experimenting and spending just less money on things that really work. So those are the things that we need to change going forward. And I think we all know the issue of informal economy, that 62% of all the workers in the world are informal, and more so in, in Africa. And you find that the majority of people are women that are working in informal economy. And with the lockdown restrictions, you find that schools are closed, meaning that women have other added responsibilities, domestic responsibilities. So they've been bearing like the brunt in terms of the pandemic. So I think as government, as cities, we are not valuing enough the contribution of the informal sector, which is really a buffer between employment and unemployment. So we need to find ways on how we support the sector rather than to put punitive measures. And then what we've seen is that people have been hungry, queuing for food, and it's not a new thing. People have been hungry, you know, before the pandemic, but now it's like an expose, you know, of all these challenges. So how do we deal with that? So the pandemic has really worsened food insecurity. Also because most of people are working in the informal sector, meaning that they depend on the daily wage to sort of eat. But also it showed us how critical it is, the informal sector, you know, in terms of food security, especially in terms of informal food traders, the distribution of food. So in terms of looking at public spaces, what is the role of public spaces in terms of growing food? And we know that one of the benefits is not just growing food, but also is issues of nutrition and also the process itself, issues of healing and also community building or social cohesion. So we've got cases already on the continent where this works. In Madagascar, we've got projects where people like small farmers are working with private sector and also in schools, because one of the key ingredients for success is the partnership, you know, in growing the food, because you need to sell if you want income. There are also cases in Kenya and also in South Africa, and also issues around vertical gardens or pop-up gardens, fruit trees, rooftop gardens. And I work for city parks. It means that horticulturalists, landscape architects, you know, they've got a bigger role to play beyond just beautifying our public spaces if the continent or the world is like in food insecure. The other issue around the discrepancies or look at public spaces with the eye of inequality is the fact that we need to integrate the public spaces. Maybe we need to look beyond access and look what exists and integrate them. So the tendency coming from city parks is to, or from the city, is to build these projects or look at public spaces as projects. So roads department or transport will build a road, it's a project for them. City parks is a project for them. So we're building silo parks or silo public spaces, not really talking to each other. So the connectivity becomes so important. Connectivity in terms of public and private spaces, in terms of open and public, but also in terms of the entire urban fabric. So there's two cases in Africa that I want to cite. One is Tekwini, where they're starting to build linear parks, really integrating hardened surfaces and sidewalks with parks and also with conservation nodes. And in Lagos, they are building a linear park where they are linking various public spaces, but also connecting them with wetlands and also promoting biking and climate smart agriculture. So things like that, if we are talking about the benefits of healthy cities and also resilient cities. The other issue that we're learning is that we need a new way of governing, you know. So what becomes the role of non-state actors? What we saw during, what we are seeing during lockdown is that you've got these big, nice projects by central government that they want solidarity fund, or there's a food aid system, you know, for vulnerable groups. But there's a problem in terms of those projects cascading to the ground, meaning there's something missing. You are missing an important constituency. How do we touch vulnerable groups? And maybe something that we are weak at, like every day, which brings in now other role players, especially civil society organizations. I think pre-COVID, there's been some fragmentation in terms of how they work, but because of COVID, we saw some solidarity, NGOs coming together, help people, and really bridging the gap where government, was found wanting. And another area besides food, distributing food, is the issue of messaging. We know that civil society organization, when it comes to advocacy, they are very good. So they managed to work in places like Kenya, South Africa, Ghana, with communities, especially in formal settlements, to use public art to communicate about coronavirus. Because one of the issues in the beginning is the fact that people were saying that no, Black people can't get COVID. So really, they really help us in terms of demystifying that, and we saw them also when it came to issues of domestic violence. Because of lockdown restrictions, people are sitting in this or living in this one bedroom house with 10 family members, and really domestic violence like sort of shoot up. And again, around issues of homelessness, they helped the state in terms of making sure that there are shelters. And lastly, we saw them in terms of water and sanitation. Because remember, if you are living in a slum, a public space is an extension of your home. So meaning that's where you get running water and so forth. So they become so important. And lastly, in terms of messaging, I think as government, we really need to learn the messages, and the message or the language is place specific. And I was doing some work around building a network of public space advocates, calling people around the continent. And once I say park, oh, they know park is a public space. And then once I say a place where there's life, or life and public space, those are the two things that go together. So in terms of how people define public space, it's like life. So we need to be cognizant as well as what doing our messages in terms of the language of the communities. And how do we do this? How do we build this equitable, community-oriented, place-specific public spaces? I think the place for us where to start is to understand our communities and map the public spaces that we have. So what we did in Johannesburg is something that UN Habitat, working in cities and also with universities and communities, they do this community-led mapping of public spaces with a view to develop citywide public space strategies in the long term. So what happens is that with this mapping, especially if you are doing it with communities, you get to understand whether you've got enough public space or you've got surplus, or you are lacking. And you get to see the discrepancies or the fragmentation that this public space are not connected, to other places. And there are spin-offs in that, because of you get to see that by having safer spaces, you need to connect this park to the school and also to the recreation center and so forth and so forth. And that way you get to empower the community. But also as city officials, also we need to learn more. We tend to learn more from the communities. And also we check issues like who owns the space, how much land that is there, and so forth and so forth. So I just want to mention that UN Habitat uses this app, it's called Kobo Toolbox, which is very simple to use to help communities to map their spaces. And it brings up the role of universities in terms of working with government and so forth. So the development of city-wide public spaces, in the end, it helps you to say, okay, now you've got this disparity in terms of unequal public spaces. So how do you start in terms of prestiging the city, rehabilitating, restoring our cities to make them equitable or inclusive? And another thing that I think we are not doing very well as government is community engagement, doing it adequately. It's messy and murky. So what we tend to do as government is to just have community hall meetings, and that is not real community engagement. So we can't really understand our communities. So we need to develop alternative tools of engaging with different segments of society. So those pictures are from a pilot project that we did in the inner city of Johannesburg, where we partnered with an NGO called Sticky Situations to really help us in terms of engaging people differently. So what we saw that there's humility that is needed from the side of government. We need to go out of the offices and be there, and we need to be humble and listen to communities. So you need city practitioners that are conscious socially, and also to look at communities, not those poor unemployed people, and see ourselves as part of communities, therefore we are resourceful. And just to mention two things, we partnered with UN Habitat, but also with GIZ, Violence and Crime Prevention Program. So UN Habitat helped us by using Minecraft and training young people and women in the inner city in terms of what kind of desires do they have or needs, or how do they want to contribute to making the parks safer. What was powerful for us is how we managed to lay in street kids and the kind of needs that they had. One of them said that we want an information wall in parks. It's something that we never thought about, you know. We built the same parks with playgrounds and benches and so forth. They wanted something different. So the use of technology sometimes can bring in other diverse needs. And one of our placemaking ex-members, they are using Kuja Kuja in Uganda, refugee camps. So that one is a real-time customer feedback system where you get to know what are people needing. So during lockdown, they did this, and parents said, we just need toys or just a ball for the kids. So it helps us to be attuned to what is happening in our societies. Just last slide, which is a project that we are working on. We are very excited about it. We are building a regional network for public spaces and placemaking for Africa. This is a hub for learning and knowledge sharing. It's a hub for African city councils, urban scholars, practitioners, and advocacy groups. For instance, with this pandemic, we had Ebola in places like Sierra Leone, Congo, and so forth, HIV and AIDS in South Africa. And of course, our central governments were learning from each other, but we missed an opportunity, just people to people, to learn about strategies. So the principle of this hub, which we want to develop to establish a center for public spaces in Africa, is how do you really build a design place-specific, equitable and community-oriented spaces. So we want to learn from other cities, and we want to build public spaces. We want to know what are universities teaching, you know, your School of Architectures, planning and so forth, what gets taught there, and who teaches, do they have local realities, is there a practical element, how do you mainstream public space to the level of housing, it must be there in the curriculum. And this is, we can do it very easily, tapping into the networks that we have, like Placemaking X and others, to bring in case studies in the curriculum. Because if you look at the curriculum, mostly it's outdated, and these theories and practices from the global north. And also we're working with a civil society organization, because we see that we need to influence how policy and planning happens and how budget, you know, is being allocated. Most of the time, public space is the first sort of budget line item to be hit or to be cut. So we need really to connect practices and to produce knowledge and messaging. And lastly, we need to be capacitated as city councils. How do we do this mapping, you know? And what does SDG mean, and how do we make sure that we are delivering or we are achieving the objectives? And how do we build these well-designed, managed public spaces? Thank you.